Gabor, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Butterfly.
I wanted to make an attempt at least to do it right. So
Alright, today
I'm going
to zoom in on the butterfly, and where the light is coming down from this angle, I'm going to strike this side of the wing with a little bit lighter lemon yellow, and this side of the wing with a little bit darker deep yellow. And then I've got some Naples and white mixed up for the foreground stones, if we get that far.
That I wrote, or that my guest wrote, you were featured, and
Alright, that'll do.
That many of the books you mentioned paint a picture of your life experience and also your life's work in many ways. And we can go in any particular order, but I thought maybe it would make sense to start with the scourge of the swastika. And that was one that you mentioned had an impact on you, or that perhaps you recommended on occasion. Why is that?
Well, so this has to do with my family's history. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, in January, 2 months before the Germans occupied the country. And Hungary at that time was the only country in Eastern Europe where the Jewish population had not been annihilated. And now it was our turn. So I was 2 months of age. The day after the German army marched into Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician said, of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies were crying. And of course, that's the infants picking up on their mother's terror and stress. And that's how I spent the first year of my life, which has had a huge impact on my development and my lifelong struggles with depression, ADHD, self-shame, and other issues. Jumping ahead now, I knew very little about that history, and my parents didn't say much about it as I was growing up. I knew my grandparents had been killed in Auschwitz. I knew my father had been in forced labor, and I never saw him for a year and a half. But beyond that, I knew not much about the details until I was about 9 or 10, maybe 11 years old, and there was a book on my parents' shelf in Budapest with the title The Scourge of the Swastika, which was written by a British civil servant and member of the House of Lords. This man had served with the British Army, and it was the first book published in the 50s that detailed the Nazi crimes. And I climbed up on a chair, took down the book when I was, I think, 10 or 11, began to read it, saw photographs of the horrors of the concentration camps and the extermination details in Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden I swooned, because I got what happened to my family. And that question of how can people do such things to other human beings would strike me every day, and almost every day this thought occurred to me for years and years and years, and almost every day I almost got dizzy with the question. So why people suffer and why people make other people suffer, and what is the origin of all that, has been a motivating question in my life. So that's why that book was so important to me.
Thank you.
And I have to say that, you know, my life's work has been motivated by that question. As a medical doctor, I'm always looking at, well, what is it that makes people be the way they are? Why do we become cruel? Why do we become victims? Why do we become perpetrators? What drives us? What kind of insanity covers our basic human nature, which I believe to be good and positive, and what happens to us?
We're going to spend a lot of time in that territory for sure.
Okay.
So you mentioned sanity or insanity. I'm not sure if that's a good segue to Don Quixote, but I'll let you choose the next one. So there are a few that came up, and you described them in brief in the pages of the book, but for instance, the background you just gave me was much more in-depth. So we have a few, and these are going to strike folks as eclectic. Winnie the Pooh, the Dhammapada, the Drama of the Gifted Child, and Don Quixote. Which one of those would you like to explain next?
Let's go with Winnie the Pooh.
Let's go with Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah. So that was one of the seminal books of my childhood, and my parents would have read it to me long before I even knew how to read. The Hungarian title is Mitzi Mocko, and it was translated...
Mitzi Mocko.
Mitzi Mocko, Mitzi the bear. And the translator is a great Hungarian humorist. So if anything, the Hungarian book is even funnier than the original English, which is not something one usually says about translations. But what struck me about Pooh, of course, was, number one, that there was this bear of little brains who was so much wiser than everybody else. So fundamentally, he found a peace inside, despite the fact that his intellect is just under-functioning. Number one. Number two, there was this relationship with the little boy, Christopher Robin. And there's a passage towards the end of the book where Christopher Robin, I don't know if you know the real story, in fact there's a movie about it right now, but Christopher Robin's father, A.A. Milne, was a writer, and he bought these toys for his son to make stories about them. And Christopher Robin actually suffered because he was secondary to his father's career. They did not have a good relationship. So these characters that the father made up kind of dominated and squeezed out Christopher Robin's own life. Mm. And he himself became a bookseller later on in his life, and he wrote about his autobiography. So there's something about the dysfunctionality in father-son relationship. But in the book, Christopher is playing with his toys, and then he starts to grow up, and he has to go to school. And he won't be able to play with his toys anymore. And at the very end of the book, there's a passage where the book ends with, but wherever they go in the enchanted forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing together. And that would just bring tears to my eyes for decades upon decades upon decades. Until recently, I had an experience, actually a psychedelic experience, when I realized that there's nothing to mourn because I'm both the bear and the little boy. And I will be playing, that nothing is lost. But when I read that book, there was a sense of loss. When I read that passage, there was something's being lost. Childhood innocence is being lost. Playfulness is being lost, which resonated with my own childhood, because I did lose innocence and playfulness very early in life. So, both for the fun and the humor. Then, of course, there's Eeyore, for whom everything always goes badly. And there's a part of me that's total Eeyore, always expecting the worst, and nothing will ever work out for me, and never mind, leave me alone, I'm okay with my own suffering, you know, that sort of determined victim attitude. That was also very much germane to my inner experience. So that book just spoke to me and made me laugh, and it still does. It's one of the funniest books ever written, and one of the wisest as well.
I'm ashamed to say this, but I've only seen the cartoon. So I know.
Well, listen, one of the sins that Walt Disney is going to be burning in hell for the rest of existence is what he did with those stories, because he Disneyfied them.
Disneyfied them, yeah.
You got to read the original,
I need to read the original.
and you would laugh your head off.
Yeah, I'm in. I wish I spoke Hungarian so I could read the translation. Which of these would you like to, and we can certainly touch on other books, but so we have three remaining on my list. Mm-hmm. Dhammapada, The Drama of the Gifted Child, and Don Quixote.
Well, let's go to The Drama of the Gifted Child. So The Drama of the Gifted Child is by a German-Jewish Swiss psychotherapist named Alice Miller, who was for 3 decades a psychoanalyst. But she realized that the Freudian psychoanalytic method wasn't helping anybody get better because it ignored trauma. So The Drama of the Gifted Child, the German title of which was Prisoners of Childhood, was really all about the fact that stuff happens to us as children, negative things happen, then we adapt to those things by taking on certain defensive ways of being, and then we relive the rest of our lives from those defensive modes. So we're not actually experiencing the present, we're constantly reliving the past from a perspective that we acquired when we were helpless and vulnerable children. And when she says the gifted child, she means the sensitive child. So the more sensitive the child is, the more he or she feels the pain and stress of the environment, and the more affected they are, and the more that shapes their lives. And that book came along for me when I was in my 40s, and I was a successful doctor, and I was a father, but I was depressed, I was anxious, I was a driven workaholic. You wouldn't have known that when you saw me on the job, but inside me I was discouraged, I had difficulties in my marriage, with my children. I felt they were afraid of me, and they were, because of my rages. And that book helped me understand. It was the first book to help me understand where all that came from. So that was, for me, as for many other people, a seminal read. And really, my whole work since then has been to help liberate people from that prison that childhood often imposes on so many of us.
This book has come up repeatedly in my life as a recommendation, as a recommended book from friends who benefited from it, who are very, certainly from any outward perspective, highly functioning, in some cases world-class performers in their fields. And I'm, in retrospect, sad that I ignored those recommendations, but it was in part because I didn't like the pairing of gifted child. I didn't want to label myself gifted child. We could certainly psychoanalyze that, but I was like, if this is a book written for people who are in, say, gifted and talented programs or have some God-given talent, for whatever reason I had a resistance to that, so I didn't read it, but The Prisoners of Childhood makes a lot more sense. Well, to me, anyway.
Well, I think it's a more accurate title, but there's two things I would say in response. First of all, why do you resist your own giftedness? You're clearly gifted. So why would you not want to find out about that?
Don't know.
Yeah, so that's something you might want to consider.
Sure.
Number one. Number two, really what she means is the sensitive child.
Yeah, so sensitive, that would draw me in because I've had, we don't have to necessarily go down this rabbit hole right now, but I've had a number of my friends recently ask me, when did you know you were so sensitive?
Yeah.
And not sensitive in a hyper-reactive way, not in a negative way, just in a perceptive way. And I'd never thought of myself, it would never have occurred to me to label myself sensitive. And just in the last year, I've been thinking about that. So this sensitive child would make more sense, or be more appealing to me.
Well, you have to think of sensitive in terms of its word origin. Now, the word sensitive came from the Latin word sensire, to feel. So the sensitive person feels more.
Yeah.
So the example I often give is, and that can lead to both very positive and very difficult consequences. For example, if I tapped you on the shoulder right now, you wouldn't feel any pain at all. But if you were not wearing your shirt and your skin was exposed, furthermore if you had a burn on your shoulder, so your nerve endings were close to the surface, if I tapped you with the same force, you'd feel extreme, excruciating pain, even though the external event was no different.
Right.
So sensitivity magnifies the pain that we have. Sensitivity also leads to more creativity. So very often the most creative people also have the most pain. Which is why so many creative people escape from their pain through all kinds of dysfunctions like addictions and so on. So there's a real link between creativity and sensitivity, and creativity and sensitivity and suffering at the same time. That's the first point I would make. Now the other thing goes back to what you said about these people that you know who are high performers. Look at that word performers. What does it mean to perform? One meaning of it is to put on a show.
Sure, that's one meaning.
And I would have been one of these people who was a high performer. In other words, looked at from the outside, successful family doctor, director of a palliative care unit at a major hospital, national columnist for Canadian newspaper, writing medical columns, performing at a high level. And inside, again, anxious, frustrated, depressed, discouraged, and in my personal life, a lot of suffering. So a lot of people who perform well are actually deeply troubled inside, and of course there's many famous examples of that. Some of the greatest performers, like Presley or Marilyn Monroe, and any number of people I could name, that's what they were performers. And even from themselves, they hid their own suffering.
Well, we are sitting in a venue right now recording this that is now known as LZR. And there is a mural of Prince outside because he performed his, as I understand it, last performance in this venue.
Really?
Before he passed away.
And before he overdosed.
Before he overdosed.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we can certainly come back to this, but part of the reason I wanted to, big piece of the reason I wanted to have you on this show was that I'm in a much better place now for many reasons that may be outside of this interview, but feeling the exact same way you just described.
Yeah.
Outwardly successful, inwardly tortured.
Yeah.
And how do you answer the question if someone meets you and you just have a short interaction? What do you do?
What do I do?
If someone asks you, what do you do?
I may be self-serving, but somebody once called me a people whisperer.
People whisper.
I do have a gift for seeing inside, because I've studied, I'm also sensitive in some ways, and I've also studied myself very deeply. I've had to, because my life just wasn't working. And as a medical doctor, I worked with all manner of conditions, terminal diseases, newborns, families, physical illnesses, mental dysfunctions. I spent 12 years working with addictions. I spent time exploring my own and other people's ADHD. And so I work with people to bring out the truth of their experience so that they're no longer prisoners of their childhood, but that they can make a conscious choice about how to live in the present moment, not based on how they were programmed in childhood. But for that, you have to do it in a way that the dog whisperer do, in a very compassionate way. Otherwise, people just shut down and they shrivel up and they protect themselves. So that's what I do. And I know, I also write and I speak publicly and so on, but the intent is always to bring insight and liberation to people.
So I'm going to come back to the medicine, because I'd love to know when your journey into medicine began. But first, since I know my listeners will say, but you forgot the other two books. What about the other two books? The Dhammapada, Don Quixote, in any order you like.
Well, let's go in the order that I discovered them, which is Don Quixote, which again I read that as a child and then reread many times as an adult, and he's one of my favorite characters. So Quixote is this deluded Spanish small nobleman who wants to revive the age of chivalry and chivalric knighthood. So he gets this broken down horse called Rocinante, and his lance and his sword, and he gets this squire called Sancho Panza on his donkey, and off they go to these adventures. And he does not see reality. He thinks windmills are giants, and he attacks them, and of course he gets hurt. And he keeps getting hurt, because he doesn't see reality. But his heart is purely committed to liberating people, to truth, to justice, to fighting oppressors, to liberating the oppressed. So here's this guy who really wants to do good in the world, and he's just deluded in his vision, but he's far truer and deeper and more human than all the people that scoff at him and laugh at him. So what a great character. And the book is both poignant and very funny. And he's one of the great creations of world literature. And of course, again, that yearning for justice is always burned in my heart, owing to what happened to me and what I witnessed.
And the Dhammapada?
The Dhammapada is the Buddha's collection of sayings, and it begins with basically the idea that we create the world with our minds. He says everything is thought in the lead. So how we see the world it determines the world that we live in. So if I see the world as a horrible place, quoting the current president of the United States, then I will be defensive and aggrandizing and selfish, because I want to take before they take from me.
All right.
Before I get attacked. I'll always be
Set
looking
that up
for
pretty
myself,
well.
because the world is not to be trusted.
I may not
So if
reglaze
that's the
the
world you live in, that's the way you can
wings entirely
and the Buddha was
now. I might
great
just do an
stuff.
edge
Can
glow.
recognize that our
I'm very
perception
happy
shape
with
the world that we
the
live in.
slight distinction
What he
between
didn't
the
say,
darker and the
that's
lighter
where
wing now with
modern
the shadow.
psychology comes
That
in,
gives it some
is
nice
that
dimension.
before with our mind we
So
create the
I
world,
think I'm going
the world
to
creates our minds. So that
do another
the kind of
session
world that we
and
live
tack
in
it on
is very
for
much shaped by early
the
experiences. Buddha
foreground
didn't say that.
stones with that Naples yellow.
But interestingly enough,
Take two coming
when
up.
you think about his search for truth, so his
Take
life
two.
began with suffering. And then he spent all his life trying to find the nature of suffering and how to transcend suffering and how to get beyond it. And this is how he ended up with this particular method of meditation and contemplation and truth-seeking. So That book was written 2,500 years ago, and psychologically, we're still trying to catch up to the wisdom in it.
So let's talk about wisdom or perhaps science first.
Yeah.
Maybe they're related in some fashion, although I know we'll dig into certainly some things that might be missing. When did medicine enter your life, or an interest in medicine? Interest in being a doctor? Either of those things?
Well, I've speculated on that, and there's a number of sources. Strangely enough, or not so strange enough, my grandfather, who was killed in Auschwitz in his 50s, happened to be a writer and a doctor. Grandson ends up as a writer and a doctor. So I think part of it was me trying to fill a hole in my mother's life. That was a devastating blow to her. This is not conscious, but I'm speculating looking back. It's not that she ever said you have to become a doctor. It's not that she ever said you have to follow in your grandfather's footsteps. But I think unconsciously I stepped into that role. Number one. Number two, another reason is that as a Jew in Eastern Europe, you had every reason to feel insecure. And my mother never failed to tell me that as a doctor, you carry your profession in your hands. So you don't have to have a business, you don't have to have riches, you just have to have the knowledge. And then you can go anywhere in the world and you'll be okay. Beyond that, healing and making this world a better place and help people lead healthy lives was just an ideal of mine. Then there was egotistical reasons. Let's face it, doctors get respect. They have a role. They have a good income. People look up to them. And they have a sense of authority that I think I lacked in my own life. So it was a combination of unconscious reasons and idealistic reasons and egotistical reasons. But all I know is that all my life I had wanted to be nothing else but a doctor. I always grew up knowing I'll be a physician.
And when you were studying medicine, what did you think your specialty or specialties might be?
Well, first of all, I should say I didn't end up following the dream because in my late teens, I just couldn't concentrate and study hard enough to get through the sciences. I could get through them, but I couldn't get the high marks needed to get to medical school. So I actually taught high school for 3 years. I taught English and history for 3 years. And then I would wake up and there's this voice in me, you gotta be a doctor, you gotta be a doctor. And so then I went back to medical school and did a lot of hard work. Already, having been an older student in medical school and being interested in history and literature and the larger picture, I always wanted to put medicine in the context of history, in the context of society, in the context of human experience, not just as an isolated science, but as part of the broader human experience. And I was interested right away in the beginning in the connections between emotions and illness, between social factors and health and so on. So I was always a larger picture person. And so that was with me already in medical school.
So the integration of mind and body as opposed to the sort of Cartesian duality and separation of mind and body.
Exactly. Not that anything in medical school prepared me for that. I mean, in medical school, you just don't get that information at all. But that was always my interest. And then when I started practicing, if your eyes are at all open, you can't help but to see it. That who gets sick and who doesn't isn't accidental, and who gets cancer, doesn't isn't accidental, and who gets addicted and who doesn't isn't accidental. In other words, there's reasons, and those reasons go beyond the individual, and it has to do with their emotional lives and their relationships and the society and the culture that they live in. So, more and more over the decades, my own personal struggles and my medical experience showed me that these connections are important.
How did you end up in palliative care? And I suppose for those people listening who don't know what palliative care is, perhaps you could give just a brief explanation of what that is. Some people might think of it as hospice care, which I'm not I don't think are necessarily identical, but how did you end up, what was the road to palliative care, and what is palliative care?
So I was a family physician, and a very driven one, and also have ADD, which means that you want to move around and have different experiences, because you get tired of the same thing. And really, in retrospect, I might say that there's some guidance in all this, but how it occurred was a series of accidents. So I happened to be walking down the hall of Vancouver's major hospital when the current director of palliative care said, "I'm quitting, how would you like to come and work in palliative care?" And I said, "Sure." You know, it took me not a moment to think about it.
He was just looking for someone to grab.
Yeah, palliative care, sure, thank you. What is that? And deeply meaningful work, because when people are facing death, they also come up against the truth of their lives. And if you can face death, you can face life.
In palliative care, meaning you're helping people to transition with terminal illness.
These are people who are terminally ill for whom nothing curative or healing is going to happen in the sense of physical healing. So they need to be helped with their symptoms, with their pain or debility or weakness or nausea. But also you have to help them go through the psychological process of adjusting to a very short future. And the people who get drawn to palliative care work, the nurses, and then the doctors tend to be a special breed. It's not, because many doctors are not comfortable with death. They're not comfortable with not being able to do something to save somebody. So you have to develop a lot of patience and a lot of acceptance. You have to let go of your power to change things. So it's deeply meaningful and deeply transformative work. And you also have to work with a lot of people with multiple different attitudes towards life and death, religious, non-religious, spiritual, non-spiritual, in denial, in acceptance, and all the stages in between. So it was beautiful, beautiful work, and one of the highlights of my medical career. All at the same time, I was still doing my family practice.
And when did a focus on addiction or an acute interest in addiction start to steer your medical practice?
So as a family physician, I've always had substance addicts in my practice, just a few. And again, it was an accident. I got fired from my palliative care job, and my argument is that I was fired for gross competence. I was just too damn good at it, but also for gross arrogance. In other words, with my spontaneous and insightful and rather radical, non-traditional style, I could have great results, and often did, in palliative care.
Well, if I might interrupt for 1 second, what would be or might be an example of your approach that others thought was radical, or something you would say, or something you would do with a patient?
All right, so that's a good step on that. I think we're getting close. After that dries and the water sets up completely solid as well, I think I'm going to reglaze the water, re-highlight the ripples, reshadow the shadows cast by the foreground islands onto the water. Then perhaps another glaze, intermediate color glaze on the foreground stones. And then I think we'll be there. Maybe an edge of light around the butterfly. But that's it for the moment. So thanks for watching this Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting butterfly. Have a good day.
I had a very busy life. I was still delivering babies, running my family back.